Just curious this morning, how many of you actually carpool to work? Anybody carpool to work or ride share? Is that the more current term? Wow, you guys are wasting a lot of gas. Okay. Anyhow, I was just kind of wondering about that. Like, I drive down 75 sometimes, and you get to Square Lake Road there, and they have the HOV lane. And, it just looks like so much fun. And I'm just sitting in my car all by myself, and and I always think it's interesting too that the HOV, high occupancy vehicle, that all you need is one other person to be high occupancy. It seems like you should have you need at least 6 or something like that. There should be somebody in every seat. I don't know what the deal is. I've never really carpooled to work, believe it or not. I guess my kids and I went to work. I went to work at the same school my kids went to attend. So does that count? Like my kids and I would drive every morning. There was one time in high school, though. After my senior year of high school, I worked at a factory along with my foster brother, Jimmy. And then there were some other guys from church that worked there, too. Rick McKay and Mark Redman, who was the English teacher of the school that I attended in high school. And then there was another kid, John Workman, who was home from college. We were all working at the same place. And we were carpooling together. And Rick McKay was the driver. And he was really exciting about driving us all to work because he just bought a Corvair. You guys remember Corvairs? So we would drive to work, and we would drive down US 12, just between Niles and Buchanan, if anybody's familiar with Southwest Michigan. But it's a 4-lane highway, and we were probably going along there every day driving about 55, 60 miles an hour, something like that. And we had seating assignments in that car. Rick was the driver, so he was always in the driver's seat. And Mark Redman, he was the old guy in the room, so he got the other front seat. And he was the English teacher, so he was always reading a book. And then Jimmy Layton would sit on one side, and John Workman on the other side. And since I was the smallest guy, I got to sit in the middle. Every single day, way to work, way home, but about 20 minutes, something like that. But we were driving this one day, and I still remember, this is the only thing I remember about my carpool experience with those guys, is we were driving down there, and Mark, of course, Mark Redman was reading a book in the front seat, and John Workman was sitting right behind him, and he was sleeping, getting a little extra doze in, and Jim was sitting on the other side of me, and Rick McKay, and Jimmy saw something out the side of the window. He says, "Hey, check that out." And so he's looking out that window, and Rick McKay's looking out that window too. So at this point, nobody's looking at the road in front of us except for me. And we're going, 70, 80 miles an hour. I don't know, the story improves as we go on here. But we're going down the road, and this car pulls out right in front of us. And we're talking about a highway, pulls out right in front of us and going about 10, 15, no speed up whatsoever. And I'm sitting in the back seat. And keep in mind, I'm the only one watching the road. And I'm realizing we are like seconds away from smearing this car. And if you remember the Corvairs, what was unique about the Corvair? The engine was in the back, right? So I'm just sitting there, we're about to smear this car, and I'm thinking there is nothing between that car and me, essentially. I'm going to die here. Now, I'm not a very fast thinker. I'm a very slow, deliberate thinker. In that moment, I was thinking pretty quickly, though. I just couldn't think of any words. And so I just started going, ha, 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 ha. And with that, John Workman woke up and yelled, "Rick!" And McKay, he had no idea what was going on, but he flipped the wheel, and I promise you, we missed that car by that much, and I'm still here today. Okay, I could try it the other way. And we smeared the car, and I'm no longer here. Whatever works for you guys, though. That's my carpool story. That's it. And my only experience here. But I want to talk about the carpool lane. We're going to be talking about that for the next several weeks here as we talk about the metaphorical carpool lane, because we're talking Jesus' time. And obviously back then they didn't have carpools. But there were 12 guys that he basically rode with. And we're talking about his disciples. And in the Gospels, oftentimes we read stories about Jesus. And the stories that we read, there's always like a crowd of people there. Except there are the stories that we read where there's just the 12 disciples there. And so what we're going to be doing for the next several weeks is we're going to look at those stories that just involves the 12, the ones who were riding in the car with Jesus. And so we're going to get started with a look at a story in John chapter 6. And this is a story that we looked at back at Christmas time. It was the last one of our Bethlehem series because it was about the phrase that Jesus said, I am the bread of life. In Bethlehem, we know that name means it was the house of bread. And so we're going to go back and look at that story. And it's a long passage, so I would encourage you to turn there, John chapter 6. Some of the pertinent verses that we're going to be looking at in a little bit are on the back, but there's some verses I want to look at before we get to those. So John chapter 6. And this is the first story in John chapter 6 is very familiar, and then as it goes on, it becomes less and less familiar to it. So let's review the story, and we'll also review even the takeaways that we had back at Christmas. Then I want to talk about a reveal, and we use that term sometimes. We talk about the reveal, like what gender is it going to be? Are we going to have a boy or a girl? We talk about the big reveal. There's a reveal that happens in this story. And then I want to finish by talking about the response that we need to make and what we're invited to. So here's the question, though, as we get started. On the highway of faith, what lane are you driving in? Or what lane are you riding in? On the highway of faith, what's your lane? So John chapter 6 tells us the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Outside of the resurrection, this is the only miracle story that we have that's recorded in all four Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all cover it as well. And generally speaking, if Matthew, Mark, or Luke covered an event or an episode or incident, John skipped it. And John went with something different. But in this case, John goes ahead and he decides, I want to talk about this miracle too. And it's not so much that Matthew, Mark, and Luke missed something. It was that John saw something and is like, oh, there's an angle here that I don't want you to miss. And so he brings up this story. And so this is the only miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, which is mentioned in all four. And to me, it's kind of weird because it's like, to me, it seems like an inconsequential miracle. They were hungry. So Jesus fed them and they got hungry the next day. And it's like, what was that all about? Well, there was a lot that it was all about. So let's look at it. So here's how it goes. Jesus teaches the crowd one day. He gets to the end of the day. The people are still there. He realizes they're hungry. And he needs to send them home, but they're probably, they're too hungry to travel. So he says to the disciples, hey, let's find something for them to eat. They find one little boy. He's got a lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish. And they split it up and they feed these 5,000 people. After that, Jesus dispenses the crowd. He sends them home and he puts the disciples in a boat and says, hey, sail across the other side. And he disappears up the hillside to pray. Well, the disciples go on the boat across the sea and a storm comes up that night. And Jesus comes down from where he's praying and walks on the water over to them. And that's also where Peter gets up and walks out of the water. And that event takes place that exact same day. And then Jesus gets in the boat, the sea calms, and it says immediately the boat was at the shore. And so they are at the shore, and the disciples and Jesus that morning, and the people who he had fed, not all of them, but some of the people that he had fed the day before are like, where'd he go? And they finally figure it out. And so they march around the edge of the lake there, and they arrive a little bit later that morning. And basically, they're looking for breakfast. He fed us last night. We're hungry again this morning. They walk around the lake, and here we are. We'd like some more. And they get into this conversation with Jesus. And what comes out of that is what we often call the bread of life discourse. And it starts in verse number 25. And so we looked at this in Christmas, and I'm going to recap it a little bit. Before I do that, though, I want to talk about the cultural context of this story and what bread was about or what bread would have meant to these people. So bread was the substance of life, the staple food. You had to have it. You had to have your bread. It was essential. It was vital. It was non-negotiable. And bread, though, had a definite shelf life. It wasn't like you go buy a loaf of bread and throw it in the pantry for a week with all the preservatives. Bread only lasted for so long. So every day, getting your bread was actually an important thing. And actually, in that day, your food, so bread plus whatever, represented about like 80% of your income went to buy that. So it was just a sustenance, economy. It was like, what do we have to do to get by here? Adding to this is the fact that most people were paid by the day. And we get paid by the week or every other week or whatever the system is. But those people were getting paid every single day, so they would take their day's wages and they would go off and buy their bread for that night and then for the next day. So if you missed a day of work, you put yourself in a little bit of jeopardy as far as having enough food. And missing more than a couple days could mean that you are in big trouble there. So that sheds a little bit of light on this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Because these people, in choosing to follow Jesus for that day, were actually foregoing their work, and they were actually foregoing their means to make enough money to buy the bread that they needed there. So when Jesus looks at them, it's not just that, oh, you guys are irresponsible, why didn't you bring a lunch? It was like, you've chosen to follow me for this day, so you've made me more important than actually, working and getting your bread, so I'm going to make sure that you're fed today. It sheds a little light on that phrase in the Lord's Prayer, doesn't it? Give us this day our daily bread. That's what they needed. Every day they needed bread, and every day that they woke up, that was the concern. And so Jesus is saying is pray for what you need for this day. It's a little different for us, isn't it? I mean, we have pantries that are full. We have refrigerators that are full that probably need to be cleaned out if you haven't done it in a while. But we kind of have this like food everywhere. They were like day to day to day to day. But that helps us to understand something that comes up in this story. Because as this conversation between Jesus and these people go on, they start talking about manna. Well, manna was something that happened back in the Old Testament, where the Israelites, they got up every morning and God fed them by putting this manna. It was on the ground, and they would go out and they would collect the manna and eat it. But it was there every single day. So when Jesus talks about daily bread, it's really easy for them in their minds to go back to this story in their history that talks about the manna that was available for them every single morning. It also helps us understand a little bit more what Jesus means when he calls himself the bread of life. Simply put, Jesus is saying, I am what you need every day of your life. Not just Sundays, not just holidays. I am who you need every single day of your life. And it helps us understand, though, why the crowd that's following Jesus here, why they don't quite get it. So let's look at the story here. Picks up in verse number 25. Jesus and his disciples have moved to the other side of the lake. Some people have figured out, they followed him over there, but we can assume that the crowd has shrunk. Some people have gone back to work. Some people didn't arrive the next morning. Jesus has moved on, and but there's these people that show up looking for some breakfast. And Jesus says in verse number 26, Jesus answered, "Verily I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and you had your fill." Jesus is saying, hey, you're following not because of me, you're following because I'm like your meal train. And you just want some more food here. And then he says, you know what? He says, you're working for the wrong food. And he uses that term working, and they're like, it hits them, they're like, oh, I guess maybe that is a little too much to ask that we're looking for free food. So what is it that we're supposed to be working? What do you want us to do? And Jesus answered in verse number 29, he says, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. He's like, no, you're missing the point, guys. I'm not saying that you need to work for food. I'm saying you need to be looking at me, and this work is actually faith. Because it's never about work or works. It's always about belief in faith and grace. And what Jesus is saying is that you're looking to me for the wrong thing, and you think you're going to get me the wrong way. You think you're going to have to work somehow. So in verses 30 and 31, the people respond like, okay, we get it. We're supposed to believe in you. But we'd like a little confirmation on this, a little validation, okay? Yesterday, we saw you feed all the people, but that was yesterday. How about today? And then they turn to this idea of manna. And their thing is, Moses fed us every single day. Can you do what Moses did? Because if you can do what Moses did, then maybe we'll buy into this. So what do you got today? Moses, day. You've just done it once. And Jesus responds in verse number 32. He says, first of all, just so you know, it wasn't Moses. It was God. But then he says this, secondly, manna was not the true bread from heaven. Yeah, it came down from heaven every day. The true bread from heaven, though, happens to be me. Verse number 34, sir, they said, always give us this bread. And Jesus goes on, he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never grow hungry. And whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. So he's saying what? Here's how I'm different. Manna, it was good for the day. I am good forever. And everybody who ate manna, by the way, got hungry again. Anybody who is in relationship with me, I provide complete and ultimate satisfaction. And so we have this conversation going on, and I don't know if people are grasping it or not, but they're thinking one thing, and Jesus saying, no, you got that wrong, and so they adjust, and it goes back and forth. But they want their physical bread, and he wants to give them something better, but they're still not ready to believe. And the conversation stops, at least with Jesus and with these people following him. And so we see in verse number 41, at this the Jews, and these would have been the people who were following the Pharisaical religion of the day, the Jews there began to grumble about him. So they're talking to each other now, not to him, because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. And they thought this seemed extreme. Why? Because he was Jesus, the son of Joseph, the father and mother that they know here. How can he say, I came down from heaven? How can he be claimed to be anything but what we know him to be, just the child that grew up around here? But Jesus stays on his theme. He says what? Verily I tell you, the one who believes has eternal life. And he repeats it, I am the bread of life. And he goes on. Your ancestors, they ate manna in the wilderness, but they died. There is a bread that comes down from heaven which anyone may eat and not die. My spiritual bread, is what he's saying here, is better than your human bread, even better than Moses' manna. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. But when Jesus said that, this bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world, he adds a new wrinkle to the story. And if you think that sounds kind of weird, yes, it sounds kind of weird, and it did to those people too. So the Jews in verse number 52 began to argue sharply among themselves and said, how can this man give his flesh to eat? Now that's where we stopped at Christmas. And here's the takeaways that we had. So this real quick is a review. The first one was this: living for the material, the temporary, and the physical is going to leave you hungry and thirsty. That's what Jesus is telling these people. You want manna, or you want things, or you want popularity, or you want these, it's going to leave you hungry and thirsty. Number two, just as God provides for us physically, he can provide for us spiritually. If God can give us manna, he can give us what we need spiritually. Thirdly, true satisfaction and fulfillment in life is impossible outside of the spiritual, or impossible outside of Jesus Christ. You will never be satisfied or fulfilled in life without Jesus Christ. That's just the facts. And then finally, he says if Jesus can provide for your basic needs like food, he can provide for your desperate needs like forgiveness and freedom and hope and purpose in eternity. And then we made a fifth point, or I guess I made the fifth point, and it's this: it's not going to be easy. Because Jesus is looking for followers and not fans. And so we go on from verse 52 into the next part of this story, which starts in verse number 53. But look down at verse number 59 first. He said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. And what we get the feeling here is that this story is moving indoors. So it started with 5,000, this huge crowd. And then the next morning, it's condensed. The people who make it around, like the Breakfast Club people, and there's fewer people there. And then we get the sense, as it moves into the synagogue, that it shrinks some more. In fact, we're going to be told here in a little bit that most of the people in the synagogue were his disciples, not just those 12, but the general crowd that was following Jesus for more than just that one day or those 2 days. But in verse number 53, Jesus says this: verily I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. He said this while teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. Okay, when you read those verses, that's kind of like, whoa, what is that talking about? That sounds kind of weird and kind of creepy. And I think that's exactly the response that the people in that day did. It's like, whoa, what are you saying? That's like, you want us to eat your flesh and drink your blood? That's kind of, that's kind of bizarre, if nothing else. And so there's an explanation, I think, for this, but there's a lot of different people who kind of chime in, scholars that have some thoughts on it. Some people say that this was just Jesus talking about the cross, how he would give his flesh and how he would give his blood on the cross. That's probably fair enough. Some people believe that this was even a foreshadowing of the Last Supper, not the Lord's Supper, but the Last Supper, where Jesus sat with his disciples and said, this is my body given, this is my blood, which is given for you. But the simplest interpretation for this is simply that Jesus is still in metaphor mode. So just as he'd been saying earlier, I am the bread of life, and nobody really thought that he was a loaf of bread, Jesus is saying, hey, you have to eat this bread, which is my flesh. You have to drink this blood, which is in me. What he's actually saying is, to live, you need me. Just as to live physically, you must have flesh and blood. To live spiritually, you must have me as part of your life. You'll have to depend on me for the essentials which I'm providing. And probably what he's saying here is actually less about the cross, though it sounds like it, and actually more about our connection and our union with Christ. That we have to be one with him, that we have to be so connected to him that it's like his blood that's flowing through our veins. And that's the idea here. You must depend completely on me. Now, verse number 60. On hearing it, many of his disciples, these are people who've been following Jesus, said, this is a hard teaching, and I agree. Who can accept it? But by this point, we're down to the people now who are kind of on Jesus' team, right? They've showed up more than this one time. They were at least fans of Jesus. You've met them on the street. Do you follow Jesus? Oh, yeah, I do. So these were actually people that were kind of on his side. Maybe they had a fish bumper sticker, or maybe they had a WWJD bracelet. I don't know. But they were the ones who would have associated with them. And yet they were like, that's pretty extreme, Jesus, what you're saying there. In verse number 61, aware that the disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? Does this upset you? And he goes on in verses 62 to 65 and says, if this is upsetting you, you're missing the point. Because when I say flesh and blood, you're just thinking about the human life, and you're just thinking about, like flesh, and when people bleed, they die. He says, you're missing the point. He said, I am talking about flesh and blood. I'm talking about death. I'm actually talking about life. Life that comes through me, life that comes through the Spirit. And so what I'm offering you offends you, but it shouldn't, because what I'm actually offering you is a better life than what you've got, because it's life in me. But it says in verse number 66, from this time on, many of those disciples, many of those fans, turned their back and no longer followed him. And this is the great reveal in the story. The reveal is not that Jesus is the bread of life. The reveal is that only some people are willing to be true followers of Jesus. And what it revealed was who was a genuine follower and who was not. But we notice here in verse number 67 that the crowd gets smaller again, and there's only 12 left at this point. Do you not want to leave, you do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. So we've gone from 5,000, we're down to 12. Doesn't sound to me like that's how to build a church, right? And yet, this is what Jesus is doing. So he says, hey, do you want to leave too? He says to the 12. And Peter says to him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. And Jesus replied, have I not chosen you, the 12, yet one of you is a devil, and obviously referring to Judas. But the question is, why did these 12 stick around when, 4,988 disappeared? Well, I think one of the answers is because they knew that they had been chosen. If you read through this, and I paraphrased a lot of it, if you read through those verses up to 52, there's a lot of it where Jesus talks about the ones that my Father has given to me. There was this idea that and they knew it and they caught it, that they had been chosen by Jesus. That Jesus has specifically said, I want you, and I want you, and I want you, and I want you. And that meant something to them. And they weren't ready to bail on that yet. But that should mean something to us too, because every person here who has a relationship with Jesus Christ, it's because he said, I want you, and 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 I want you. That's pretty awesome to think about. It wasn't like you got up one morning and said, you know what, God, I'm just coming because you need me on your team. It wasn't like that at all. It was like God said, you know what, I don't know if I need you on my team, but I want you on my team, and I'm going to choose you for my team. And if you've trusted Christ this morning, it's because he chose you. And if you're still kicking the tires on faith, he's giving you an invitation, and that's him choosing you as well. Secondly, as those 12 disciples, they had witnessed things that the crowd had not. They had been with Jesus a lot. In fact, they had actually seen things in these 2 days that the crowd hadn't seen. They had seen how all the stuff got distributed. If you put 5,000 people in a room, it's pretty hard to see what's going on in the corner where Jesus is breaking the bread and they keep going back for more. But those disciples were right there. They saw that. They also were out there in the boat and they saw Jesus walk to them on the water. They saw Peter walk on the water. They saw the storm stop. They saw them go to the land immediately. So they had been privy to things that nobody else had seen. They had a front row seat as to who Jesus was. And that may have been why, like, hey, we're not going anywhere. Everybody didn't see what we just saw here, and they could add to that. But I think the real thing is that they had already made a choice based on something different. Look at what Peter says there. He says, where else can we go? You have the words of life. And I've always looked at this like Peter is saying, well, I mean, Jesus, we already given up everything else. What are we going to do at this point? I mean, I guess we got no choice but to follow you. Or maybe it's like this, like, well, I don't know, Jesus, we've checked out everything else. It doesn't work either, so we might as well go with you. And I've always kind of read it a little bit that way. I think what Peter is saying is, you know what? We've looked around. We're not interested in what else is out there. We are interested in you. We are not going anywhere because not just did you choose us, we choose you. And notice the why that he gives here. Why did they choose Jesus? Because, what verse is it there? He says, Lord, to whom else should we go? Because you have fed the 5,000. Doesn't say that. Verse number 68. To who else should we go? You walked on the water. It says, where else should we go? You have the words of life. The why he gives, it wasn't about the food. It wasn't about the cool miracle and Jesus walking on the water. It was about what Jesus was saying, what Jesus was teaching, who Jesus was. Peter, I think, and the disciples, I think, in this moment, they actually got what Jesus was saying. Jesus was saying to the crowd, hey, if you're going to follow me, you got to make it all about me. And Peter's like, yeah, we're good with that. And it's interesting that he doesn't just say me. He talks about we. He says we are all in. We are not going anywhere. What a great answer. What a great challenge to us as well. I've been talking about India, and I probably will for a while here because it's still on my mind, but had a chance, I think in 3 different cases, to sit down with pastors Well, actually, the first two we were in a meeting like this with 70 pastors, and two of the pastors got up and shared about how their life had changed since they had trusted Christ. And they talked about how they had been disowned completely by their family. And when you're disowned by your family, you lose your inheritance, and you also lose your means of making an income. And they're like, that's what happened to us. We've been completely disowned. They don't want anything to do with us. And we're put out on the streets as homeless here. But that's okay because we want to follow Jesus. And one of them talked about how he had actually been beaten up for his faith. And he said, that's okay because I want to follow Jesus. And that's what is going on here, is Peter saying, we are all in. We sat down with another pastor who is told of coming to Christ, and her husband is a worshiper in another religion, and he actually took their child and left her alone. And she's trying to figure out how to make it, and she's got the choice of following Jesus. And she says, this is where I'm going, but please pray for me. But those are people whose choices are based on what Jesus said, not necessarily what he's doing. Choices based on what Jesus said, not necessarily what the circumstances around look like. Based on what Jesus said, and that's all about who he is, and not who we want him to be, or who we hope he is, or what we hope we can get from him. Which brings us to our response here this morning. And I just want to ask 4 questions, and then I have a bonus question as we conclude this morning. First of all, where are you looking to find real life? And we have people in our world who are looking at a lot of different places to find life. And whether it's in entertainment, or whether it's in distraction, or whether it's in having things, or whether it's in success and achievement, or whether it's just like having every experience in the world that you can have, where are you looking to find your life? Are you trying to find it in yourself or in something around you? Or are you trying to find it in Jesus Christ? Because there's only one place to find it. It's in Jesus. The second question is this: how much are you connecting with Jesus? That's what this story, when he says, I am the bread of life, the invitation is, I want you to connect with me. I want you to be so connected to me that you're dependent on me for your life. So is Jesus a priority in your life? Is your allegiance to him deepening? Are you showing trust in greater and greater measures? What steps have you taken recently that have built that relationship and that dependence on Jesus? How much are you connecting with Jesus? And then the third question: are you willing to accept the hardness of following Jesus? Because it's going to be hard. And we don't want it to be that way. We want it to be all like when we get hungry, Jesus shows up and all 5,000 of us get fed. And Jesus is like, no, it's not going to be like that. Following Jesus is actually going to be hard. Following Jesus means making tough choices. Following Jesus means pursuing him when it may cost you something. See, Jesus will say things to us that don't necessarily make sense, but we still have to follow. He may ask us to do things that don't look like fun. He may put us in uncomfortable situations. Jesus could demand more from you than what you bargained for. He might ignore your immediate desire because he's got some long-term good in mind for you, but you can't see what it is. He might keep a spotlight on those areas of life where you need to change and just will relentlessly pursue you, because that's what he's going to be like. He's going to make your life better, even though it might be harder. That means he may not answer those prayers of yours. That means he may not fix that situation that you're in. Following Jesus might mean that it's going to be, you might have to take a little ridicule at work or at school or something like that. It might mean that there's a little bit of friction that comes in your family because you're following Jesus. It's going to be hard. Are you willing to accept the hardness of following Jesus? You might not get everything you want. You might actually be disappointed by Jesus. You ever been there? I think most of us have. And then we have to say, okay, we can say it like, where else can we go? I don't have any other choice. Or we can say, you know what? This isn't what I would have picked. This isn't how I would have planned it. This isn't what I was hoping it would work out. But you know what, Jesus? You have the words of life, and I'm not giving up on that. I'm not changing my mind. How much are you willing to follow Jesus when it's hard? Fourth question is this: do you want Jesus for who he is or for what he can do for you? And I think this is a mark of maturity in our Christian faith. Like, we come to Jesus because we want what he can give us. He can give us eternal life. He can give us forgiveness. He can give us freedom. He can give us hope. He can give us all these things. And we come to Jesus because of what we think he's going to give us. But the invitation goes a whole lot deeper than that. He says, come to me for who I am. Come to me for the relationship. Yes, you can have all of those things. That's part of the reward. But come to me for who I am. And that means even when it doesn't work the way that you think it should work. And I'll just tell you that about faith. It won't always play out exactly the way that you think it's supposed to play out. But do you still want Jesus for who he is? Or just for what he can do for you? I think it's interesting that Peter focuses on, like, Jesus, we're following you for your words. And that might be a great challenge to all of us. It's like let me pay closer attention to the words of Jesus. If you got a Bible there with the red letters, that really helps you out. Everything that's in red, he said. But to pay attention to those things. But do you want Jesus for who he is and not just what he can do for you? Which leads us to our bonus question for today. On the highway of faith, which lane are you in? We've noticed in this story, we start with 5,000, then we get the next morning, and that's been reduced to we don't know how many. And then we go into the synagogue, and that's reduced to another number. And then finally, we see Jesus standing there with just 12. But it kind of reminds me of the lanes on the highway of life. And I think we can say the lanes on the highway or the freeway of faith. There's the lane on the far right. You know the people that drive in that lane, right? Those are the ones who are traveling cautiously. They are the ones who are enjoying the scenery. They're also the ones who are making themselves available to the exit ramp. And anytime they need to, they can actually get off the highway because they're right there. And I think that compares to people in our world, maybe like the 5,000. They're the ones who are happy to give the religious thing a try, to give the church thing a try. They're willing to see if it works for them. And, they're not opposed to religion in any way, shape, or form. But they're always traveling in that right-hand lane because if you ever need to, you can just catch an exit real quick and jump off. And maybe that's the lane that you're traveling in. Like, yeah, okay, I'm kind of testing this out. I'm thinking about it. But then there's the middle lane. And those are the people who are going a little bit faster. They've been on the road probably for a little while longer, and they're not looking to get off. They're just kind of going with the flow. They're the ones who are spiritually interested. Kind of, but no big commitment. I think kind of like the group that showed up the next morning. They're in the Christianity thing, they're into the faith thing, they're into the church thing, the religious thing, but they're kind of in it for what it's for, what's in it for me. So yeah, we're going with this because, man, I like this. I get some friends here, and I come to church, and I get encouraged here. And it's all these things that are like, this is great, but they're in that middle lane. And then there's the fast lane, that third lane. The people who are trying to get somewhere, they're actually committed. They're making some effort. And I would compare them to like the synagogue crowd that were called the disciples. They would be fine with telling people that they follow Jesus. And it would be more than just for the food. But they're following Jesus as long as it's easy, as long as it's not really requiring anything personally, as long as Jesus fits their mold of what they think he is or should be doing. And I think there's a lot of people, maybe a lot of Christians in the fast lane. And I think there's probably a lot of people in churches today who are in the fast lane because if you looked at them, it's all like, yeah, they're going for Christ and they're they got their pedal to the metal there, and I mean they're showing up every time the doors are open, and they're doing everything, and they're teaching these classes, and they're helping the small groups, and all these different things. And yes, those people, they're in that lane, and yes, they're going somewhere, but I don't think that's still the lane we're supposed to be in. Because in the highway of faith, there's the carpool lane. And that's the lane where people are riding together. And in our metaphor, that's the lane of the people who are actually riding with Jesus. And to them, it's not just about church, it's not just about religion, it's not just about Christianity, it's about Jesus. And every day it's about Jesus because he is the bread of life. He's the manna that comes every morning. And these are the people who are in it. It doesn't matter how hard it is, how bumpy the road gets, even if there's potholes. In the carpool lane, they don't care because they're in it and they're riding with Jesus. So which lane are you in? Let's pray. Jesus, we read this story, and it's not the easiest story to understand. It's not an easy story to hear. But I pray that we would be encouraged by it. Encouraged by the fact that you choose us. Encouraged by the fact that you invite us to ride with you. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. There is one more lane I didn't mention. That's the entrance ramp. Maybe you're not even on this highway of faith yet, but you're ready. Jesus is reaching out to you. He's choosing you and he's inviting you. You can accept that invitation to say, Jesus, I'm going to follow you because I believe that you came and that you died for me. You gave your flesh, you gave your blood for me. You rose again so that I can be forgiven. Please forgive me and come into my life. I want to follow you. You can get on the highway of faith this morning. But if you've gotten on this highway, the question is, which lane are you in? And the truth of the matter is, we kind of bounce around, don't we? We'd like to think we're in the carpool lane, but then we drift over and we're in that next lane where we're busy serving, but we're not really busy being. Or sometimes we get to that middle lane where it's just kind of like going with the flow and where it's all comfort and convenience. Or sometimes we even get all the way to that right-hand lane where it's like, I don't know about this. And like, boy, this is a whole lot harder than I thought it would be. Which lane are you in? And what would it take to get you to the carpool lane? Will you make that commitment this morning? So Jesus, we look at this story and we're challenged, and at the same time we're encouraged because you invite us to ride with you. May that be true for us this week, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.